Fantasy sports, what started as a friendly game among sports nerds, has exploded into a global phenomenon worth billions. But how did this seemingly niche hobby turn into a massive industry that now rivals the NFL, NBA, and MLB? The answer might shock you. Fantasy sports isn't just a game. It's a money-making machine with high-stakes players, billion-dollar companies, and more drama than your average Sunday game day. Stay with us because the rise of fantasy sports is about to blow your mind. And by the end of this video, you'll understand how this industry became one of the most lucrative powerhouses in the world. Believe it or not, fantasy sports has been around a lot longer than most people think. The roots of this multi-billion-dollar industry date back to the 1960s, when a small group of baseball enthusiasts created a game called rotisserie baseball. The concept was simple. Participants would draft real players onto imaginary teams, and their performance in real games would determine the success of the fantasy team. For decades, fantasy sports remained a niche hobby, limited to die-hard fans who would crunch numbers with pen and paper. It wasn't exactly mainstream, but in the 1990s, something changed. Something that would take fantasy sports from the back pages of sports magazines to the forefront of the internet itself. Suddenly, fantasy sports moved online, making it easier for fans to join leagues, track players, and compete with friends. Websites like Yahoo Sports and ESPN began offering free fantasy platforms, and the audience started to grow. But even then, no one could predict what was coming next. An explosion that would take fantasy sports to the next level. Fantasy sports had gone digital, and the number of players was growing. But could this really become a multi-billion-dollar industry? After all, it was just a game, right? Wrong. Fantasy sports was about to turn into big business, and the people behind it were about to make a fortune. So how did a pastime for sports fans turn into a money-making powerhouse? Keep watching, because the answer is even crazier than you think. The 2000s were a pivotal decade for fantasy sports. As broadband internet spread, so did fantasy leagues. Platforms like Yahoo Fantasy Sports, ESPN, and CBS Sports revolutionized the industry by creating easy-to-use websites that allowed users to join leagues, track stats, and draft players. Fantasy football, in particular, exploded in popularity. Suddenly, sports fans weren't just watching games, they were part of them, managing teams and competing for bragging rights. But here's where it gets interesting. Fantasy sports weren't just changing the way fans engaged with their favorite sports, they were changing how people watch sports. TV ratings for NFL games began to soar as more people tuned in to follow their fantasy teams. Suddenly, games between teams fans didn't even care about became must-watch TV because they had a player on their fantasy roster. The ripple effect was massive, and sports networks like ESPN and NFL Network capitalized on the growing interest with shows dedicated to fantasy analysis, strategies, and player updates. But while traditional fantasy sports were booming, something even bigger was brewing. A new type of fantasy sports was on the horizon, one that would take the industry from millions to billions. And it was about to get a whole lot more competitive. If you think traditional fantasy sports were big, you haven't seen anything yet. The next evolution was coming, and it would change everything. The rise of daily fantasy sports would turn casual players into high-stakes competitors, and it would bring a whole new level of excitement and controversy. Stay with us, because the billion-dollar breakthrough is just around the corner. In 2009, a new twist on fantasy sports was born: Daily Fantasy Sports, DFS. Companies like DraftKings and FanDuel launched platforms that allowed users to enter daily or weekly fantasy contests rather than playing for an entire season. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Instead of waiting all season to see how your team performed, DFS let you draft a new team every day and compete for cash prizes, sometimes in the tens of thousands or even millions of dollars. And just like that, fantasy sports went from a fun pastime to a high-stakes game with real money on the line. Millions of players started flocking to these platforms, drawn in by the allure of big payouts and instant gratification. DraftKings and FanDuel became household names almost overnight, and the DFS industry exploded. By 2015, the DFS market was valued at over $2 billion. But here's the twist. With big money comes big controversy. As DFS grew, critics started to ask a crucial question. Was this gambling? States across the US began to crack down, questioning whether daily fantasy sports were a form of illegal betting. Lawsuits were filed, politicians got involved, and for a moment, it seemed like the DFS bubble might burst. But the industry fought back. DFS companies hired lobbyists, pushed for new legislation, and rebranded their platforms as games of skill rather than chance. And it worked. Today, daily fantasy sports are legal in most US states, and the industry continues to thrive. The daily fantasy sports boom was impressive, but was it sustainable? Could these platforms keep growing, or was it all just a flash in the pan? Stick with us, because the DFS craze wasn't the end of the fantasy sports revolution. It was just the beginning. The rise of daily fantasy sports may have been the tipping point, but it wasn't the only reason. Fantasy sports became a multi-billion-dollar industry. Traditional fantasy leagues, DFS, and the integration of sports media all combined to create an ecosystem that turned fantasy sports into a money-making machine. Let's break it down. 1. Media partnerships. Companies like ESPN, Yahoo, and CBS turned fantasy sports into a central part of their sports coverage, making it easy for millions of fans to get involved. Dedicated shows, websites, and podcasts began popping up, all designed to help fantasy players dominate their leagues. And as fantasy sports grew, so did advertising revenue. Every page view, every click, and every show dedicated to fantasy advice brought in more ad dollars, turning sports media into a key player in the fantasy sports economy. 2. Sponsorship deals. Fantasy sports platforms like DraftKings and FanDuel struck sponsorship deals with major sports leagues. Suddenly, you couldn't watch a football or basketball game without seeing ads for DFS platforms. These partnerships helped legitimize the industry and brought in millions in revenue. The NFL, MLB, and NBA all jumped on board, turning fantasy sports into a mainstream business. 3rd, mobile revolution. The rise of smartphones took fantasy sports to the next level. With apps like ESPN Fantasy Football and Yahoo Fantasy Sports, fans could manage their teams from anywhere. The convenience of mobile fantasy leagues kept fans more engaged than ever, driving even more players into the industry and keeping the momentum going. 4th, betting integration. As sports betting became legalized in more US states, fantasy sports companies like DraftKings and FanDuel started offering traditional sports betting alongside fantasy leagues. This move opened the floodgates to an entirely new revenue stream, turning these companies into dual giants of both fantasy sports and sports betting. With fantasy sports now integrated into media, betting, and mobile apps, you might think the industry has reached its peak, but the truth is, the fantasy sports revolution is far from over. What's next for an industry that's already worth billions? The answer might surprise you. Keep watching. The fantasy sports industry is still growing, and the next big breakthroughs are already on the horizon. So, what's driving the future of fantasy sports? It all comes down to 3 things: technology, data, and global expansion. 1. Advanced analytics. Fantasy sports are all about numbers, and as technology evolves, so does the data available to fantasy players. Advanced analytics, artificial intelligence, and predictive modeling are all becoming integral parts of the fantasy sports experience. Players can now analyze stats like never before, giving them a competitive edge and making the game even more addictive. 2. Virtual reality and immersive experiences. As virtual reality, VR, technology continues to advance, fantasy sports platforms are exploring new ways to immerse users in the experience. Imagine watching your fantasy football game in VR. with real-time player stats popping up on the field. It's not as far-fetched as it sounds. Fantasy sports is on the brink of becoming more interactive than ever. 3. Global expansion. While fantasy sports are huge in the US, the global market is still largely untapped, but that's changing fast. Countries like India and the UK are seeing a surge in fantasy sports players, and companies like DraftKings and FanDuel are expanding their platforms to cater to international audiences. In countries where cricket and soccer reign supreme, fantasy leagues are becoming just as popular as they are in the US. The global fantasy sports market is projected to grow exponentially in the next decade, with billions of dollars in potential revenue up for grabs. The key to this expansion? Localization. Fantasy platforms are tailoring their offerings to different sports and regions, ensuring that the content resonates with local audiences. This global push is the next frontier in fantasy sports, and it's setting the stage for even greater growth. The US may be the heart of fantasy sports, but the world is catching on quickly. Could fantasy sports truly become a global phenomenon? With advancements in technology, the answer is yes, and the industry is on track to see growth like never before. Stay with us, because we're about to explore how fantasy sports might just take over the world. So, how did fantasy sports go from a basement hobby to a multi-billion-dollar industry? It's all about engagement. Fantasy sports transformed passive sports fans into active participants. Fans aren't just watching games anymore. They're analyzing player stats, making trades, and feeling personally invested in every play. This level of engagement has turned casual viewers into die-hard fans, driving viewership, advertising, and, most importantly, revenue. But it's not just the fans who are benefiting. Professional sports leagues and media companies have realized that fantasy sports players watch more games, consume more content, and spend more money on subscriptions and merchandise than the average fan. As a result, leagues like the NFL, NBA, and MLB have fully embraced fantasy sports, making them an integral part of their growth strategies. Fantasy sports isn't just a game. It's a machine that drives billions of dollars in revenue each year. And as the industry continues to evolve, its impact on sports culture, media, and entertainment will only grow. What started as a small hobby is now a massive juggernaut that shows no signs of slowing down. Fantasy sports has already conquered the US, and now it's setting its sights on the rest of the world. But what does the future hold? Could the industry double in size? Triple? With new technology, global expansion, and the rise of sports betting, the possibilities are endless. Stick with us, because the ultimate answer to how big fantasy sports can get is coming up. The rise of fantasy sports has fundamentally changed the way we experience sports. No longer are we just passive spectators, we're part of the action. Fantasy sports has created a deeper connection between fans and the games they love, and that connection is driving unprecedented growth in the sports industry. But beyond the dollars and the data, fantasy sports has also changed the culture of sports fandom. It's no longer just about supporting a team. It's about being an informed, strategic player. It's about using stats, knowledge, and intuition to make decisions that directly impact your fantasy team's success. In many ways, fantasy sports has turned millions of fans into virtual coaches, GMs, and analysts. As we look to the future, it's clear that fantasy sports will continue to play a major role in shaping the sports industry. With new technology, global expansion, and the rise of legalized sports betting, fantasy sports is poised to become an even bigger powerhouse. And for those who are already invested in this world, the ride is far from over. So, what's the final takeaway? Fantasy sports may have started as a fun hobby for a small group of fans, but it has evolved into a multi-billion-dollar industry that shows no signs of slowing down. From traditional leagues to daily fantasy sports, from advanced analytics to global expansion, fantasy sports has transformed the way we engage with the games we love. And as the industry continues to grow, one thing is clear: fantasy sports is here to stay, and it's only going to get bigger. If you've been fascinated by the rise of fantasy sports, hit that like button, subscribe to Revenue Racers, and drop a comment below. Do you think fantasy sports will continue to dominate the sports industry? What's the next big innovation in the fantasy world? Let us know your thoughts.